Okay, I'm going to give you a quick overview of like the need to know stuff about the main people and movements within the Reformation. Um, that's just in case the video isn't working for you for whatever reason. I actually unusually I think that video, that documentary, does a better job on this topic than I do. I think that probably only applies to the Reformation, which I have to say is my least favourite topic in the entire semester to cover. Eh, I'm not a religious historian. I like doing religion in the Middle Ages because at least it's gross, with all of those relics and stuff. I find that a lot of people find the Reformation really fascinating. I'm not one of those people. You probably are. So anyway, I'm going to give you a quick overview, which I don't think it'll provide that much more than the documentary, but it might. I mean, sometimes it's good to hear things multiple different ways. I think the most important thing to stress is that the Reformation does not appear out of a vacuum. It's not like people wake up overnight, and certainly Martin Luther, pictured here, did not wake up overnight and is like, hey, you know what? Let's just found an entirely new sect of Christianity. That didn't happen. If we think back to the Black Death and what was going on in the 14th century, there's a lot of people very dissatisfied with the church. It comes, Reformation in the 16th century comes out of a very, very long period of calls for church reform. And a lot of that was caused by dissatisfaction after the 14th century. Both, it's not like people get any less committed to God or their beliefs. It's just that they get increasingly fed up of the way the church operates because, as we encountered a couple of weeks ago, there's the papal schism, not to be confused with the Great Schism. Schism is just a fancy word for split. So there's loads of schisms within the church. So don't get the one between the Western Catholics and Eastern Orthodox confused, because that happens in 1054, whereas the papal schisms, like the ones with, oh my God, there's so many popes, that is in the 14th century. So they're two different, very different events. And so there's the Avignon papacy as well. So the papacy, right at the top, is very weakened. It is being questioned. And then, as we know, after the Black Death and the 14th century, people they turn to themselves, and they want a more individual experience and relationship with God, whereas it was much more communal in the Middle Ages in general. I'm being very general here. So people are looking for reform in the church. They're looking for a more personal experience with their beliefs. And so this is building by the time we get to the Reformation. Indeed, a lot of the things that we consider like the hallmarks of the Reformation these have been suggestions like around for hundreds of years. But there is one big difference that probably explains why the Reformation had to happen when it did. And I'm going to come to that after we talk about Martin Luther, because Martin Luther really is very, very effective with this new technology, which means the Reformation kind of had to happen when it did. Well, I suppose they could have reformed the church, and there are arguments. We're going to talk about the reforms in the Catholic Church, and there's arguments that this period of reform was already well underway by the time Martin Luther came along. It was just not as big a break as some people wanted. So we're going to start off with this guy, Martin Luther. Martin Luther's big issue that he is just so pissed off with is the issue of indulgences. Now, we have encountered indulgences before. They've been around for hundreds of years in the church. It goes to this theory, this idea of purgatory, which we're all very familiar with. Everybody got that question right on the midterm. Yeah, where you go to be purified of your sins after you die. And as we talked about, there are different things that you could do to lessen your time in purgatory, like doing good deeds, give charitable acts, giving money to the church to look after the needy. Okay, so there's lots of good things you can do to lessen your time in purgatory. Everybody sins, but if you're a good person, you get less time than, say, you murdered someone in purgatory. Oversimplification, but if you think back to the ghost story I told you, there's good comparisons of the different experiences people could have in purgatory. Well, it became to the point where it gets very transactional. It gets corrupted. And so there's a lot of people, not just Martin Luther, a lot of people are really fed up with the transactional nature of do things for the church and you get out of purgatory. It used to be that you gave money to the church to do good deeds in your name. And then you've got the theory that the less time in purgatory, because good deeds are being performed in your name. You know, much as if like we give money today to charity because we're not doctors or trained to administer the charity, but we'll give money to the charitable people to do it for us. And it gets, so it kind of operated like that in the Middle Ages. It gets very corrupted in that people, it becomes a situation where people give money and the money equals getting out of purgatory. You give money to the church, and they kind of forgotten that actually money is just the vehicle to doing the good deeds. So this is what Martin Luther is really, really angry about, the transactional nature, the corrupted nature of how people were acting about the afterlife. His main concern is the issue of these indulgences, which is what they call the giving money, and in exchange you get less time in purgatory. It is being transacted as what we call an indulgence. Now, this has been around for a while, and it has been used for arguably nefarious ends. For example, if we think back to the Crusades, remember that everybody wanted to go on crusade because they got remission of sins. So there's an example of doing something that gets you out of purgatory in one clean swoop. So it has been around for a while, it has been abused, and this is what Martin Luther is really, really upset about. What tips him over the edge, so we get to the point of this meme, is that he is formulating his ideas. He's within the church. He wants reform within the church to begin with, is that there's a new indulgence campaign started, and this one just tips him over the edge. It is the straw that has broken the camel's back. He's formulating his ideas opposed to indulgences when Archbishop Albert of Mainz, who controls the area in which Martin Luther was located, this is called Wittenberg, he wanted to become bishop of several other areas as well as Mainz. So there's another example of corruption within the church. To do this, he needed a special dispensation from Pope Leo X, who, by the way, was a Medici Pope, to do so. And to do this, he needed money. He borrowed the money to buy his extra diocese from a banking family called the Fuggers. And then he did a deal with the Pope whereby he would sell indulgences and could keep a bit of the profits back for himself, and he was using that to pay back his debt to the Fuggers. Now, that is very corrupt, even by anybody's standards. But, you know, the indulgences campaign that Pope Leo X had called was actually in response to an earthquake that had hit Rome. And so it was to rebuild after an earthquake. So it necessarily wasn't a bad thing. It was the way that they conducted it that really got under Martin Luther's skin. And he wasn't alone in this. A lot of people were really fed up with how things had become. Because this is just one example of corruption within the church. There are lots and lots of issues and objections. So Martin Luther, who was at the University of Wittenberg, wrote a letter to Archbishop Albert laying out his oppositions. And these were laid out as 95 points, or as they are famously known, the 95 Theses. Theses sounds like something like oh my God, he wrote 95 books. And we didn't. A thesis is a scholarly point of argument. So they're actually, you're going to be reading them shortly. They're actually some of the easiest primary sources that I'll have you read in this class. You'll be like, oh, there's only 2 sentences each. These are really easy. So nice, easy primary source for you to reach. What he was getting really upset about was particularly the actions of one guy called Johann Tetzel, who just seems like a really awful person when you read the accounts. He was doing a really slimy snake oil job of selling these indulgences, and Martin Luther was particularly directing his theses, his scholarly points of argument against Johann Tetzel and Archbishop Albert of Mainz. Now, the story goes, if you flick back to the meme, I don't always nail things to doors when I do stuff happen. So the story is that he nailed these 95 theses to the door of the Wittenberg Castle Church on the day before All Saints' Day, 1517. And this was because mass attendance would have been very high on that day. But, you know, most people in Wittenberg would, you know, you'll find those sources easy to read, but most people in Wittenberg in 1517 would not. You need to be an educated person to make sense of them. So a lot of historians think that this is, you know, a nice story, but really Martin Luther was writing with an educated audience in mind. He wrote them in German. They were quickly printed in German and Latin. So from this point on, Martin Luther refined more and more of his ideas. But his key idea was faith, that you could close the gap between God and man through faith alone, and to do this, the scripture was central. That if you approach the text of scripture with trust in God and faith, it will be clear to you. And as a result of this belief, he felt that the Bible should be available to all in their own language, and this is what we call the vernacular. But, of course, many people were illiterate. So that documentary also showed you another way that Martin Luther was really successful in spreading his ideas to ordinary people, and that is through music. So make sure you see that point from the documentary. But I mentioned the key word, printing, okay? This is why Martin Luther is super, super successful, and why I said at the very beginning, I don't know if the Reformation could have happened at any other time, because he was using the latest technology. To excuse the the time in which I am saying this, but his ideas go viral, and it's because he uses a new technology, and that is the printing press. The printing press was not invented until around the 1450s, we think maybe 1455, in the workshop of Johannes Gutenberg. And what he invented was actually not just the printing press, but the movable type printing press. Basically, you get the individual letters, you put them on a frame, and then you print many copies of the same image, and eventually you get a book or pamphlet. And so the first thing that Gutenberg printed was, sign of the times, a Bible in 1455. The movable type meant it could be printed faster than block. The other big development that happens around the same time is the availability of paper. Now, if we were in class, I'd ask you what were they using before then and what was around before the printing press, and we would all be reminded that they used vellum and that everything was manuscript or handwritten. So, and then I would ask you, what's going to happen when you've got paper and you've got a movable type printing press? And you would tell me, wow, you can make things for much faster, many more copies, and that's going to bring the price down. And you'd be absolutely right. So this is, to us, okay, 70 years is a long, long time, or 60 years is a long time. But technology spreads a lot slower historically. So it's still fairly new by the time we hit the early 16th century. And this map is to show the spread of printing across Europe in the first 50 or so years after the invention of the printing press. The books that are printed within the first 50 years of the printing press, and we have one of those in the library in the rare book room, is called an incunable. And that's from the Latin, and it means from the cradle. So they're book babies. We reckon that within the first 50 or so years after the invention of the movable type printing press, about 20 million of these incunables, or incunabula, I always want to say incunabula, but it's incunables, were printed across Europe. So Martin Luther is coming along a little bit after this. Printing is well underway, and he recognises it for the use that it would have. Because books are cheaper, and as a result of books being cheaper, literacy, which was already on the rise, as we know from an earlier class, was continuing too. So Luther understood the importance of printing. He authorised the printing of his works, and this helped turn his ideas not just from ideas but into a movement that stretched beyond the borders of Wittenberg. Printers in turn recognised that, hey, people want to read this, he's a bestseller, and so they printed more unauthorised copies in the local languages as fast as they could. And it was through writings that Luther formulated his ideas further, such as popes could make mistakes. So could councils. And remember, it was a council. That was already a sign of reform in the church, but it was a council that ended the papal schism. He said that people outside the church should be able to reform the church, that there should not be as much of a distinction between the clergy and the people who they ministered to, and that celibacy was nonsense because marriage brought spiritual advantages too. Wasn't just Luther, though, who was propagating Reformation ideas. There were several others. Let's have a look at some of them. You will watch them in the video. Another reminder to go and do that. Ulrich Zwingli is discussed in the video. He's a contemporary of Luther's. Luther was in Germany, Zwingli was in Switzerland. Zwingli goes with the other Z, Zurich in Switzerland. Switzerland's a real hotbed of religious reform. So we're going to get to another reformer in Switzerland. So that, just remember that they're in two different parts of Switzerland. So the Zs go together. Zwingli is in Zurich. He was at one of the biggest churches in Switzerland. He agreed with Luther about faith being the most important thing, not good deeds, and the scriptures being important. And he had already begun to translate the Bible into Swiss German, the vernacular, for people to read it. They did disagree, though. Zwingli wanted a simpler church service. He thought that it should be plain inside for people to focus on the Bible itself, no singing apart from the Psalms. But their biggest issue was over the Eucharist. Now, the video, I think, does a really good job of explaining this, but it's kind of a complicated thing and yet a simple thing, so I'll explain it again here. The Eucharist is, the bread and the wine part. That is about the bread and wine that Jesus gave to his disciples at the Last Supper. And this is one of the hottest topics in the Reformation. Catholics believe in transubstantiation. That is, when the priest says, this is my body, this is my blood, the bread and wine are transformed into the body and blood of Christ. This could only be done by a priest. That gives them authority over others. So this reinforces the central role of the priest. And this is again reinforced by the fact that the priest is the only one in the service who's going to drink the wine. Luther rejects transubstantiation, but he believed that it was still really important because sin was forgiven in the Eucharist and Christ was present in the consecrated bread and wine. This was as a result of God's mystery, though, not the actions of a priest, and faith was the thing that made the sacrament effective. Zwingli, though, disagreed with Luther. He saw the Eucharist as simply a memorial service in which Christ was already present amongst the faithful, not in the bread and wine itself. It was a sign of God's grace already given, not a means of giving grace. So this was a big fallout between them. They used print to attack one another. They had slanging matches in print throughout the 1520s. They got together in 1529, tried to reach a compromise. They did not reach agreement. Both were very clever, though, and knew that they had to get the politicians on their side to make this actually happen, their reforms actually happen and stick. So Zwingli worked very closely with the City Council of Zurich. Cities were therefore very fertile places for Reformation ideas to spread. Remember that it's a very different population and makeup in terms of occupation and background to the countryside. So whole territories converted to these Protestant, these reformed ideals when cities would bring in reformers to help re-educate the people and the clergy. So this would allow for entire areas to become Protestant. Now, I'm going to flick through a couple of slides here to get to the last of kind of the big three Protestant reformers. Here he is. He's also in Switzerland, but remember, a different part of Switzerland. He's in Geneva, and this is John Calvin. He, again, is a reformer coming up with a new version of Protestantism. He had become Protestant in 1533 and fled to Geneva in Switzerland, where he published his main work, The Institutes of the Christian Religion. The key concept to Calvinism is predestination. That is, God has already determined who will be saved. Predestination was around in Catholicism before then, but Calvin makes it absolute, and he makes it like the key concept of Calvinism. Basically, your actions can't change your fate, but good work, hard work, thrift, good moral conduct would indicate that you're already one of the gods chosen for salvation. John Calvin, that is, really shows how Protestantism worked very closely with local politics. Calvin worked with the city government of Geneva to set up a church governance and structures. So Geneva was attempted to be transformed into a community based on Calvinist principles. So this included creating different new bodies like the consistory, who were a group of pastors and lay elders in charge of investigating and disciplining deviations from proper Calvinist conduct. So they did things like ban drinking and gambling and fighting and disciplining people who did. And if you're charged of a crime, you could be excommunicated, civil as well as church, or even executed. Calvin also set up an academy to teach those who wanted to know more about Calvinism so they could go back to their home communities and spread the word. So we can see this in England and Scotland. So Puritanism, and I'm sure you all know Puritans from your American history, in England, they were influenced by Calvinist ideals and combining that with the state church in England. And then in Scotland, one of John Calvin's followers, who was trained in his academy, John Knox, made Scotland a Calvinist country by integrating these church ideals with government. And so the Kirk is the name of the state church in Scotland. Okay, but to go back a slide, when we move outside of the Protestant Reformation, there are actually more Reformations. At this point, if we were in class, would say, am I right in calling this class the Reformation? And we would sort of discuss about how the fact that it's not Reformation singular, it's Reformations plural. Because there's the Protestant Reformation, but there is also a radical Reformation and a Catholic Reformation. And then there's also the Henrician Reformation, which is actually a type of Protestant, really. But okay, so the radical Reformation is different, though, again, because they are rejecting the idea that Luther, Zwingli, and Calvin are even going far enough. The radical Reformation is like a group all lumped together. They all are very, very different in their ideals, but they're united under the heading of radical because they all want a more radical break from what these other Protestants are doing. Their ideas differ hugely. Some of them said that they wanted to follow Christ's commandments literally. Some of them wanted to go back and live like it was in New Testament times. One thing they do tend to have in common is this nickname they get given of Anabaptists, which means rebaptizers. Basically, that babies should not be baptized, that it should be adult baptism, or if you were already baptized, as these people would have been done because they would have all been baptized Catholics, rebaptism, to reflect that you've chosen to belong to this church community. A lot of them are also pacifists, meaning that they refuse to hold office or swear oaths. Swearing oaths was a big, big, big thing back in this time period, because remember, in period of they don't have, literacy is pretty widespread, but not the way it is today. And printing press is increasing, but still printed materials not the same as today. So if you were going to do anything, you generally took oaths. So if you refuse to take oaths, that's kind of a big middle finger to the whole way of society running at this time period. Sometimes they reacted very harshly to people who deviated from the group. They would shun them. That means that they would ban them and throw them out. But others argued for complete toleration. So really the only thing they have in common is that they want a more solid break from the past. A lot of them were not highly learned, but artisans and peasants who wanted a more active role in the church hierarchy that they'd been heretofore excluded from. A lot of were women, therefore, because they were also excluded from being able to actively participate in the church. So a lot of this slide picture on the right here should show you how many groups have their origins in this movement. Today, they might be very different from how they were back in the 16th century, but a lot of groups we're familiar with today have their roots in these movements. Now, I'm going to move on to the Counter-Reformation now, but there's a train about to go past. I'm going to see if it honks its horn, so that it's very quiet so far. Okay, I think it's decided it's not going to alert us to it going past. The Counter-Reformation is one of various names for the same event. It is also known as the Catholic Revival or the Catholic Reformation. Indeed, I think Catholic Reformation is probably a safer term, because Counter-Reformation implies that you're responding, as counter to something that already existed. And there's a lot of persuasive scholarly evidence that the Catholic Church that is, was already reforming of its own initiative by the time Martin Luther came along. It just wasn't maybe as fast or as effective or as far-reaching as many people wanted. Because I think one thing we've talked about throughout the semester is that religion and religious beliefs are not static. They change over time. They are reformed, particularly in calls. We've seen lots of calls for reform because of corruption before. Remember our monks? Well, our monks were the original reformers in a way, or, you know, OGs, because they said the church was getting too worldly, and there were lots of different monastic movements over time because they believed that the previous movements were getting too worldly. So there is a long tradition of reform within the church, but it really, this time, a lot of people believed it was not going far enough. The reason why a lot of scholars say we need to call it the Catholic Reformation, not the Counter-Reformation, is that the Reconquista in Spain, which was the process from 711 to expel the Muslims out of Spain, it took them until like the end of the 15th century to do that, meant that the Catholic Church was encountering a period of new confidence. That it had new power because of the Reconquista to be able to enforce reforms. And the video goes into more detail about that, so definitely watch the video. My video, that is only giving you a quick overview to reinforce key points. The main body of reform for the Catholic Church was the Council of Trent. Councils, we know, were already a reforming idea because that was what solved the Papal Schism. So the Council of Trent was from 1545 to 1563, and it opens this period of Reformation that is closed at the end of religious warfare in Europe in the middle of the 17th century, which is what the next video is going to be about. And the video also, the other video, the documentary, explains how we tend to think of, from a European standpoint, of Protestantism, the Protestant Reformation being the most impactful, but actually the Catholic Reformation is the most impactful if we're coming from a global perspective. Catholicism becomes the world's first global religion. Okay, so the fallout from the Reformation is that it brings more than 100 years of religious war. That is one of the main impacts in terms of early European history. There is an outbreak of violence in Europe, and whereas up until this point, the chances of you being killed because of your religious beliefs are pretty slim, unless you're a heretic, of course. This 100 years that follows the beginning of the 16th century is a very bloody and brutal period in European history, and there's a pretty good chance you're going to be killed for your religious beliefs. These wars all merge political and religious issues. Okay, so that's one of the main Reformation results, is religious wars. And I'm going to talk in my next video about religious wars in France, and then in the video after that about religious war between England and Spain. But up until that point, I want you to go and have a look at these 95 theses, stumbling over my words, and answer a quick question on them.